Good morning. I admitted Donald. Yes, I'll make you co-host so we can just test out everything right now before everybody sees it.
Yes, great, thank you. We can maybe also stop the recording and start it when we start the session.
Yes.
All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the second day of the Bridging Transportation Research Conference, the Western Track. Today, we have the pleasure of having Professor Donald Shoup as our headliner, who has been given the title The Parking Rockstar by the Wall Street Journal. So Dr. Shoup is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research has focused on how parking policies affect cities, the economy, and the environment. In his books, he details the simplest, cheapest, and fastest way to improve city life, protect the environment, and promote social justice. His book, The High Cost of Free Parking, has been translated into Russian, Romanian, and Persian, and good news for our Chinese-speaking audience, is about to be published in Chinese. Dr. Shoup is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and an honorary professor at the Beijing Transportation Research Center. The American Planning Association gave Dr. Shoup its National Excellence Award for Planning Pioneer, and the American Collegiate Schools of Planning gave him its Distinguished Educator Award. Now, before we get started with the talk, let me remind everyone that if you have questions, please leave them in the chat box down here, and then we'll read them at the end of the session. And with that, without any further ado, let's hear it from our parking rock star, Dr. Shoup.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I was honored when I was called a parking rock star, but then I realized a parking rock star is not the same thing as a real rock star, although I have thought of changing my name to Shoup Dog. I was also happy when the paper called me the Yoda of urban planning, until I remembered from Star Wars that Yoda was 800 years old. And most of what he said seemed like nonsense to me. I think to understand the bad situation we're in now with parking, think back to when the car was new, and the John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford had asked you to devise planning policies that will increase the demand for cars and fuel. And think of these three options. We divide the city into separate zones, so that there's a long way to travel between activities. There's housing here, jobs there, you go someplace else to shop. So there'll be a lot of travel between zones. And then you limit density everywhere by limiting the height of buildings and the floor area ratio. So if you limit the density, then everything will be spread farther apart, and that will increase travel demand. And then what I'll talk about today is the third one. The third policy is to have minimum parking requirements so that the drivers can easily park free at the beginning and end of any trip they're going to make. So if we have these three, that cars are the natural way to get anywhere. Well, unfortunately, these are the three policies that cities have adopted, and it isn't because automobile manufacturers lobbied for this. That I think the odd thing is that once people got cars, it was the drivers, and then almost everybody else, who argued for free parking. That they want free parking everywhere. The Ford and Chrysler and GM didn't have to argue for minimum parking requirements. We argued for them. So I think that our zoning does do all these three policies the automobile and the fuel industry would really want to happen. So I recommend that we do something different. I think we're doing everything wrong. So I think that I have three policies that I would recommend. Is that instead of free parking, I think we should charge the right prices for curb parking, which is kind of a tautology. Who could argue against the right price? But by that, I mean it's the lowest price that cities could charge and still have one or two vacant spaces everywhere. So that everybody will have great parking karma. Whenever they whenever they arrive at their destination, there'll be a curb space waiting for them. So if it's only one or two open spaces on every block, the spaces will be well used, but they'll also be readily available. And I don't think you could get better than that. The second policy is to make these prices politically popular, is to spend the revenue on public services in the metered neighborhoods, to clean the sidewalks, to plant street trees, to trim street trees. Some parking benefits give free Wi-Fi to everybody in the district. There is a lot of money that come from charging for parking, but it has to have the right recipient before it gets to be politically popular. You want the stakeholders, that is the people who live there and work there and have business there. They're the ones who say, yes, we want these meters because we want the benefits. So they can be politically popular at the local level where they're important. And then once you have those two policies, the right price curb parking and it's financing public services, then you could remove the off-street parking requirements, because nobody can say there's not enough parking. There'll be open spaces wherever you go. So I think that the benefits of removing off-street parking requirements will be enormous, and I will talk about that mainly today. But I'll just briefly mention the demand-based prices. 85% is an easy way to describe it. The occupancy rate that you're looking for, and about 15% of the spaces are vacant. So I think that we have the technology for doing this now. The meters could charge different prices at different times of day and at different locations, so they can be changed without touching the meters. Everything can be done through the cloud. So I think that one of the main benefits of the right prices that they'll avoid this cruising for parking, driving around hunting for a space. Here's a diagram showing what's wrong with curb parking now is that some blocks, all the spaces are occupied. You have to hunt for parking. On other blocks, there are plenty of open spaces. So if you could just nudge up the price on the top block and down on the bottom block, you could get what I think would be the right occupancy. It's a small change. As some people think that changing prices and from one time of day to another or one block to another is just too big a revolution for us to do. But if it's like the Reformation or Prohibition, but if we can't move a car from one block to another by nudging prices, what can we do? It's one of the simplest things that cities could do. And it's important that they do it to end all this cruising for parking that has been found in so many cities. That here's I think studies of 23 places that on 18 cities on 4 continents. They look for cruising where they expect to find it. But between 8 and 74% of the traffic was cruising, and the average time to find a curb space was between 3.5 and 14 minutes. Now, this doesn't mean that this is what happens in most places, because you only look for cruising where you expect to find it. But there are hot spots. That wherever it's a popular place that a lot of people want to be, the curb parking is free. It's going to create cruising, which is very unfair. We've all done it, and it's frustrating that you don't really know how long it's going to take to find a space. It always seems to goes to somebody else. Here's a great video about cruising that I filmed on my most recent trip to Austin. Um, well, I guess I'm afraid it's not showing that. It was Kara Cockelman was the one who was doing the cruising. um, but I think if we could get the price right and spend the money right, we could we we will avoid what we've created. The minimum parking requirements do a lot of damage. Uh, uh, Peter Hall defined a great planning disaster as a planning process that costs a lot of money and has gone seriously wrong. And I think minimum parking requirements fit this exactly. Uh, they encourage us to drive our cars, and the city is planned for free parking. It's low densities with sprawl. It often looks ugly. Um, the required parking spaces increase the cost of housing and everything else. Makes it hard to reuse older buildings that don't have all the required parking, and they damage the economy by raising the price of everything. And of course, they harm the environment. You have to realize now that that they're helping to create global warming. Here's a picture of Silicon Valley. And I think too much of suburban America looks like this view. We tend to ignore all this asphalt blight, especially when we're parked free in it, as all these cars are on a weekday afternoon. The cost of parking doesn't go away just because the driver doesn't pay for it. The cost is still there, and it has to be paid for by somebody, and that somebody is everybody. Here's what it looks like when you get farther up in the air. Um, the street names, I think they're on Sumac and Alder, and they're named after trees, but I don't see, this is not really a park. But why does this happen? Well, it's because San Jose, it's in the city of San Jose, requires this, as every city does. Here I've taken their parking requirements and um, show them with 1,000 square feet of the land use, which is in green, and then the red is the size of the required parking lot. That it's hard to understand exactly why they're different or why they're the same. I suppose dancing and skating are similar. Why don't they have the same parking requirement? Why does a dance hall have the same parking requirement as a restaurant and an auction house? Why how often do they have auctions? And uh, when you actually look at the zoning code of any city, it looks like this. This is for San Jose, just one of many pages of parking requirements. It looks as though planners have done a lot of research on parking at every dance hall and amusement park, and golf course, and pool room, or skating room. Perhaps planning for parking isn't such a bad profession if you get to go to all these places to set the parking requirements. And it goes on and on for many pages that you have to have a parking requirement for every land use. It looks scientific. Um, and like the periodic table of elements, every land use has a specific parking requirements, but planners are really winging it. And parking requirements are similar. Uh, to sorcery rather than to science. These parking requirements are a fertility drug for cars. Uh, Here's just a sampler of what these parking spaces look like, parking requirements look like. And it makes sense. It seems to if you could charge related to the number of people, say one space for the barber and one space for the person in the barber chair. There are gender differences, which are hard to understand exactly. But when you get away from, uh, well, I think it's always one space per person, usually, except for religious uses. And even then, there's a gender distinction. But if when you get away from the number of people, the most common thing is the number of square feet of the use. Uh, and if it's 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, that means that the parking lot is the same size as the Sex Novelty Shop, for example, the floor area of the building. But when you get away from that, from something, the square feet, what do you do? Well, you get very inventive, but there has to be a parking requirement for everything, even for the afterlife. Um, So these parking requirements are what engineers call a kludge. It's the various definitions of it that with lots of complications that are hard to understand. Anybody who uses Microsoft understands the concept. Um, that there, when you look at it carefully, it's a real mess. A messy but functional fix for a workaround for a problem like using duct tape. Here was a study, one of the first, on what happens when you begin requiring off-street parking. This was from a study in Oakland that was done on real estate values. It was a 4-year study, and right in the middle of the study, the city imposed its first parking requirement, and so they found out what happened before and after the parking requirement. So after the parking requirement, the construction costs rose by 18%, and the number of apartments on a typical lot fell by 30%. Well, why is this? Well, developers said that adding an apartment required another parking spaces, but enlarging an apartment did not. So they built fewer but larger apartments and devoted more land to parking. So they got fewer units. But this was just in one case, one parking space per dwelling unit. And now cities have 2, sometimes 3 parking spaces per dwelling unit. So you see this twisting has been going on for a long time. We get more expensive housing and less of it. Because that's the way parking requirements are what they're telling the developers to do. Well, where do the planners get these numbers? That they don't know a lot of things. They don't know how much the parking spaces cost. Neither do you, or neither do I, because it varies enormously from one place to another. But they're never free. Um, and the planners who set these parking requirements of 2 or 3 parking spaces per dwelling unit, they don't know how much this affects the cost of housing and everything else, or urban design. It's all numbers. There's nothing there that is um, showing the effects on the design. And they don't know how it affects traffic congestion. How many more parking spaces will affect how many people want to drive, or affect air pollution, or fuel consumption, or CO2 emissions, and they have no training in how to set a parking requirement. I'm sure none of you did, and nobody who goes to a planning school does, because the professors have nothing to teach them. That the planners are winging it. It's more of a political skill than a technical skill. So I think we're politicizing what should be businesses decisions, and governmentalizing what should be market choices. Well, because planners don't learn anything about parking requirements in planning school, um, where do the parking requirements come from? Well, there are two things for transportation planners and engineers. It's one is a publication called Parking Standards. So it isn't really about standards. Everybody wants high standards. Uh, it's just about what other cities require. So you could copy from another city. And the more ambitious thing is parking generation, which some of you may know about coming from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. But I'll talk about these two uh, separately. Let's start with parking standards. Uh, it's public. There have been several editions of it. Well, who would oppose high standards? Um, this simply reports the parking requirements in a small, non-random selection of cities that have imposed these parking requirements so that planners can copy them. And in the 1991 survey, all the land uses could fit on one page. In the next survey, there were 8 pages of the 660 land uses. This page just goes from abattoir, it looks like, down to boarding house. So there are many more pages after that. Uh, one thing to look at, if you could see it on your screen, is there's so many different adult uses. That I think 9 different adult uses. And we don't have to be told what does adult mean. Um, everybody knows that. The planners must have done a lot of research on these adult uses to set all the different parking requirements. And here, that was just the index. Here is the pages of parking requirements for, starting with, this is the very first page, adult land use, of course, is very close. And you think, if this is what planners think the world should look like, either the cover of the book or this picture, we're in tough shape. And then once you have the land use, you have to know what is the basis of the parking requirement. Is it people or homeless children or fuel nozzles? Or when you look at those, many of them, look at them carefully, you would have a hard time knowing, well, what really is this holes? What is holes about? Well, that's for a miniature golf course. And the planners are quite frank about how little they know. They have published several standards. They just tell people how many requirements that other cities do impose, and they're very frank in saying that this is a very big question for planners. There's a lot of concern, but we really don't know how to do it. It was the first study in '64. We don't know what the assumptions are. Maybe we're just copying other people's mistakes. The next survey, oh, most parking requirements are mysteries. So and then you don't even know whether some places require more land, more parking than another. And here is the survey that was just for one land use. One land use, with each one taken alone may make sense. They look sense, but when you look at them all together, they raise grave doubts about parking requirements. In fact, they're no better than the 19th century phenomenon of phrenology, another pseudoscience. It was a leading theory of the study of the brain. They thought that different parts of the brain govern different things like cautiousness or ideality or um, friendliness. But this sound, you could tell just by feeling the skull whether this person was was very good at deduction or something like that. But this is really now, of course, nonsense. I think here's a nice modern day phrenological bust. I think if I had one, I would certainly have a big bump for parking. But that that I think that it's like saying that you could tell how many parking spaces a gas station needed by looking at the number of fuel nozzles. It's really, I think parking requirements are very much like phrenology. What more of you are probably familiar with is parking generation, published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Even the phrase parking generation sounds a bit ridiculous, but there it is. So these generation rates are the peak parking occupancy observed at a site. And you should look at it for a whole day or a whole week, and you look only for the peak occupancy, the highest occupancy ever observed. And then you have to do it at places that have their own parking lots. So you can say how many people park to go to that grocery store or uh, McDonald's or something like that. So it has to be in suburban areas with parking lots for a specific use, and they say that's an area with little or no transit ridership. Um, and here's how they explain it. What is the ideal site? Ample convenient parking for the exclusive use of traffic generated by the site. So they're quite frank about what they're looking at. And they're very precise as well. I think precision is so common in parking requirements, and certainly in parking and generation. But it's very unscientific. Say, if you ask somebody how far is it from San Diego to San Francisco, and they told you 632.125 miles, you think that they were very accurate, especially if it maybe came from the National Geographic Society. But that's not accurate because the correct answer is 460 miles. If you said something somewhere between 400 and 500 miles, who would pay much attention to you? They would look at the 632.125 miles. And I think this is one of the real problems with the parking generation and trip generation. And they're used everywhere. It's so important in all kinds of transportation engineering. It's a key reference for transportation planners and transportation engineers. And well, here is one of the pages showing it, what it was like. This was in an early edition, the second edition. It reports the peak number of spaces occupied on a weekday at a familiar land use, a fast food restaurant. The floor area of the restaurant is on the horizontal axis, and the peak number of parking spaces occupied during a day is on the vertical axis. So each point of the graph represents one study based on one site on one day, a parking occupancy observed at one restaurant. And dividing the peak occupancy observed in a study by the floor area of the restaurant gives the parking generation rate for the study. And notice that the largest restaurant generated one of the lowest peak parking occupancies, while a mid-sized restaurant generated the highest. And you could look at the fitted curve equation. The scattergram suggests that the parking occupancy is unrelated to floor area of this sample, and the low R squared of 0.038 confirms this impression. So the floor area explains only 3.8% of the variation of the peak park occupancy. So if you believe the regression equation, the peak occupancy at a restaurant would be 20 spaces plus 1.95 spaces for every 1,000 square feet. But look at the average rate up there as up here. This is the parking generation rate that is reported. 9.95 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet is very precise. Doesn't it look accurate? But you can see that it's just unrelated. the parking occupancy is unrelated to size in this sample. It's precise, but it's certainly not accurate. Well, here is the next figure. This comes from the next generation of edition, 17 years later. And it looks more elaborate. You can see here where the red arrows are. It's gone from 9.95 down to 9.0 vehicles per 1,000 square feet. They've added a few observations, but it's basically the same graph as before. So it looks more elaborate, doesn't it? But people, but again, the parking occupancy is really unrelated to the square feet. But it's odd that the regression equation is gone. They don't show that. Let me see. I think look, here's the previous was use carefully, low R squared. Well, how do you carefully use something that shows there's no relationship between the two variables? But then the next way, the regression rate is gone. Why doesn't it show it? They don't explain this for parking generation rates, but they do show it for trip generation rates. Is that why three criteria are met? Is that the R squared has to be greater than 0.25, and you have to have a sample size of more than 4. Most of them don't have a sample size greater than 4. And look at the third variable. That this is very unscientific. Suppose the R squared is greater than 0.25 and the sample size is greater than 4, but vehicle trips decrease as the floor area increases. That is, the first two criteria are met, but the third one is not. Then they would not show the regression equation. So the stated policy on reporting it conceals evidence that contradicts the presumed relationship. That is anti-scientific. And so here we get a more even newer one. Again, the regression equations, R squared, are not shown. Presumably it would reveal that the sample has no statistically significant relationship, but now it's 9.98 vehicles per 1,000 square feet. And again, you have the largest restaurant has almost the lowest peak parking occupancy. So if this were a drug test, say for a vaccine for COVID, and these were the results you got, would anybody ever approve the drug? No, you would never want to do this, but it passes for science in transportation engineering. And the median parking requirement for a fast food restaurant in the United States is 10 places per 1,000 square feet of floor area. When the ITE speaks, planners listen. What else do they have to base the parking requirement on? So compared to the first edition I showed you in 1987, which reported the regression equation, the fourth edition is more elaborate, but less honest. And I think Mark Twain was right about most things, I suppose. But the American Planning Association and the Institute of Transportation Engineers have led city planners to believe things that just ain't so. And they have helped create the mess we're in. We have ample free parking everywhere, or almost everywhere, mainly except for the parts of the cities that were built before modern urban planning was was practiced. So that the engineers provide most of the data, and the planners require new land uses to supply enough parking spaces to accommodate this peak parking demand. And the cost of providing the required parking is ignored. So it's a circular thing that just keeps going around and around. And the first step, you have the ITE publishes the parking generation rates. And the second step, planners use these parking generation rates to set the parking requirements. So the maximum observed parking demand becomes the minimum required parking supply. And then in step 3, we have ample free parking everywhere. And then in step 4, ITE looks at the trip generation rates. How many trips will come from and to these land uses? And then step 5, you have to design the transportation system to handle all these trips, and that produces the urban sprawl. And that's where we get back to step 1 and look at the parking generation rates. So I think that the results are awful. The planners seem to think the demand is a number, where economists think it's a relationship between price and the amount of parking occupied. And planners in zoning orders, they require at least enough spaces to meet the demand for free parking, because that's what people want. Everybody wants free parking. So urban planners are simply doing what the citizens say they want. So the free parking drives both transportation and land use. And this example of what what I call the hiding hand. Most of you are familiar with Adam Smith's invisible hand in economics, which was a nice metaphor to explain how when in a well-functioned economy, that people produce the bread and the beer, not because they want people to enjoy bread and beer, but because they want to make money. It's for their own interest. And so they're being led as if by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of their intention. But the hiding hand in city planning is different, is that we hide the cost of things. Minimum parking requires hide the cost of the free parking and higher prices for everything else. The cities don't subsidize parking. It's not in any budget. No one knows who really pays for it. And it's not just with parking, of course. Most of you must have been looking at the infrastructure budget, which is now to spend $1 trillion mainly for bridges and roads, which is again for cars and not paid for by drivers. It's paid for by taxpayers. So we've done a great job of hiding the cost of most automobile use. It is the parking spaces seem to come from Santa Claus. We don't even think of where they come from. That small children, we once believed in Santa Claus, but you get older, you get disillusioned, you realize there isn't any Santa Claus. And then when you're older still, you realize you are Santa Claus. And I think we've all become Santa Clauses for parking. And so we have so much of it. So I think when it comes to parking, transportation planners and engineers resemble the Wizard of Oz. In the 1939 film, the unmasked wizard resembles a hapless urban planner trying to set the parking requirements. He desperately twiddles scientific-looking knobs, and when his audience expresses doubt, he roars, "Do you presume to question the great Oz? I mean, should I presume to question the Institute of Transportation Engineers?" So I think for some people, parking requirements are almost a religion. But compared with the parking requirements, Scientology looks scientific, and the Wizard of Oz was a scientist. In reality, the patron saint of free parking is the Wizard of Oz. We can't challenge these parking requirements. We just have to obey. So when Toto did pull the screen aside, then you saw the wizard, And he looks like a hapless urban planner trying to do his best. That I think in foretelling the demand for parking, urban planners resemble the Wizard of Oz, deceived by his own tricks. I mean, we are deceived by our own tricks. So no one should blame planners uh, for pretending to know how many parking spaces are needed, because everybody wants to park free, and land use planners are under terrific pressure to solve the problem. Um, but I think planners and transportation engineers can be faulted for their pretension to special skills in dealing with parking. Um, that people are making us do things that everybody should know can't be done. So I think that the planners cannot predict parking demand any better than the Wizard of Oz could give the Scarecrow brains or send Dorothy back to Kansas. Urban planners are good people and transportation engineers are good people, but they can't help but being humbugs when they struggle to appear methodologically rigorous about parking requirements. And the results are catastrophic for cities. But what would happen if cities stopped requiring parking? And if you charge the right price for curb parking and spend the revenue in parking benefit districts, well, we'll have a lot of benefits from it. It'll reduce the cost of housing and increase the supply, because every house or every apartment won't have to come with 2 or 3 parking spaces. People who are willing to live with one car, or maybe even none, will be able to find housing that costs less. And it isn't just housing, is everything. People who are too poor to own a car have to pay higher prices at a grocery store so the richer people can park free when they get there. I think we should unbundle the cost of parking from everything else. And the cities would look better if there were less parking, be less congested. We'd have cleaner air, and we'd certainly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, if all these benefits are available to us, why haven't we seized them? Well, because there is a downside. The drivers will have to pay for their parking, and cities will have to manage their curb parking. But I think that if the cities did remove their parking requirements, um, and unbundle the prices of parking from all other prices, we'd have a lot better looking cities. The zoning requires several homes for every car, but it ignores homeless people. How can we get out of this mess? Well, the parking lots are some for very nice. I went to the parking lot to look at the ground truth, and it's a wonderful part of the world. This is a great place to be if you're a car. Uh, but what if we said that, well, we're going to get rid of these parking requirements? The Cisco Systems this is their campus. That goes on for a long way, and that's a rail line of the lower part of the corridor just being built. So this is transit adjacent development. So if you got rid of the parking requirements, Cisco could build housing around the perimeter. You can do it with anything with Photoshop. And I took these buildings from the University of London. They must have been cleaned just before I took the image. But this is the sort of thing that would be built in Silicon Valley. So I took some buildings from downtown Los Angeles, apartment buildings, to show what would be more likely outcome. So that land now devoted to parking can be developed as housing once the cities remove their off-street parking requirements. And employees who live in these new apartments could just walk across the parking lot to their offices if people will still be going to offices. We'll have to start charging for parking. There won't have to be any underground parking here. This land is already assembled. It's not a brown site. It's great land in a wonderful part of the world. So you could build the houses without parking and greatly reducing its cost. And if it worked out, there could be more of it because housing is wildly expensive in San Jose, and we'd like to have more of it. And we've got a lot of job adjacent sites for housing if we remove our parking requirements. We just have to say, let go. That these parking requirements are doing so much damage. Without it, the world could be very different. If you walked or drove along that street, you think you were in a real city. And you don't know that inside it is a parking lot and an office building. Um, it'll help a lot of solve a lot of the problems that we have. Here's a picture of it in downtown Los Angeles. I think it has a school on the ground floor, it's apartments above. I'm not recommending that this is what you should build. You could have office buildings around the perimeter. You could have courtyard housing. You could have commercial. You could have stores that whatever the market would say is the best use of the land. So I think there would be a lot of benefits from this. Um, think of all the complaints that we have, you know, the long commutes, dirty air, traffic congestion, high housing costs, global warming. It will create jobs. I mean, because we can import cars and fuel, but you can't import apartments. This would create a lot of jobs for architects and drywallers and electricians and plumbers and laborers. And increase the housing supply, which everybody says is the number one issue in dealing with our homelessness problem. Our commutes would be a lot pleasanter and shorter, and we spend less on cars and fuel, which we import a lot of those. Um, and we'd have less traffic congestion and air pollution. And whenever I go to a parking conference, I say, well, it would increase the demand for technology because you have to have technology for charging for parking with license plate readers and apps. The touchless parking, that a lot of it, a lot of the payments for parking can be automated now, and it would even slow climate change. So the downsides again is the drivers will have to pay for parking, and the cities will have to manage to manage their curb parking. Well, I think we have a choice of two futures: change nothing about parking policies, just keep curb parking free or cheap. A lot of people want that. Um, and it seems natural. We don't have that many parking meters, but when we do have them, the money disappears into the general fund and provides no political interest in having parking meters. And then we have to require off-street parking. Um, well, we can't change the past, but we can change the future. And I see that there's a better future waiting for us. This this current system we're in is quite terrible. Here is an advertisement trying to get people into a cheap car. People who have to who who buy a cheap car then have to support it, and we'll have a lot of congestion. This is a picture in LA. It looks like it's typically every day. Sort of looks like a mass evacuation after a hurricane or before a hurricane. But there's a second future, which I think would be much better. We reform our parking. As I said, charge the demand-based prices for curb parking and use the revenue to improve neighborhoods, to pay for cleaner, safer sidewalks, more security. Some cities give free transit passes to everybody in the business district, paid for by the parking revenue. Do you think downtown business district would be better with free curb parking and expensive transit, or market price curb parking and free transit for everybody who works there? It's a fringe benefit that that is paid for by drivers. So here's a T-shirt with a sign from in Arlington, Virginia. So I think this would generate a lot of support both on the left and on the right, because it'll appeal to a lot of people. The liberals will see that it increases public spending, that we won't be what John Kenneth Galbraith is affluent societies called private affluence and public squalor. We would have a better public sector. And conservatives will see it reduces government regulation, and environmentalists have a lot to praise in this, and business will see that it reduces a very expensive regulation on them. And the new urbanist will see that, well, maybe urban design will be a lot better. We could live at a higher density. And libertarians, there are a lot of them, that they increase see opportunities for individual choice. And the property rights advocates will see the government is not telling them what to do with their property. And developers will be out from under a terrific cost. And the residents will see, well, gee, so my neighborhood is a lot nicer looking now. The trees are healthier. And of course, housing advocates have a lot to gain from this. The neighborhood advocates will see that it means that we make our decisions at the local level. And the local elected officials are the ones who will gain the most, because they won't have to send through endless city council meetings about how much to raise the price of curb parking by 25 cents or so. And they will leave it to the market to handle with these things. What will we do with all the cars we won't need? Well, here's a sculpture I like called long-term parking in France. What about all the parking garages that we built and won't need? Here's a use that I think maybe you could try at the University of Texas. Well, I think a planner can't finish with anything better than a quote from Jane Jacobs. We're not a wealthy country because of what you and I have done. We live in a wealthy country because we were born here or we came here. And I don't think we're doing enough for the future. Here's a quote from President Eisenhower in his famous farewell speech as president. The military-industrial complex speech. We now seem to be plundering the resources of tomorrow at a rate that President Eisenhower could not have imagined. And of course, our finest writer among presidents was Abraham Lincoln. And I think our case is due, and it's time to think anew about parking and to act anew. Now, you probably don't hear a professor ending a lecture with quotes from 2 Republican presidents, but I suspect that all of our presidents would agree with Eisenhower and Lincoln. Despite the institutional inertia in urban planning, reforms are sprouting. And paradigm shifts in urban planning are often barely noticeable where they're happening, and afterward it's hard to tell that anything has changed. But I think that you have a great opportunity to make changes. Until we get this, I think we have to just be better planners. Well, that's about all I know, so I better stop. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. And I think there are 5 minutes for questions that you probably might want to fit in. I've enjoyed having this opportunity, and I look forward to anything you would like to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shoup, for the very insightful and informative presentation. So we have a number of questions in the chat box, so I'm just going to read them for you. We have a question from Elena Wilson. She asks, I keep hearing that NYC has about 2 to 3 million free parking spaces, overwhelmingly on street parking. Not surprising, given how car dependent large cities have become because of free parking. But knowing the glacial pace of policy change and concerns about equity, what will it take to change this more quickly and in more of an equitable way?
Well, I think that the way to do it is with parking benefit districts. To start with this, to tell that you're right. The New York City has 3 million, or roughly 3 million parking spaces. Nobody knows, but this is the number from their Department of Transportation. And 97% of them are free. They only have meters at 3% of the spaces. So it's the most valuable land on earth that is given away free if you bring a car. Um, and the way to get uh, around this, I think, is to have these parking benefit districts. I've just finished a study of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, between the Central Park and the river, where there are about 200,000 people and 10,000 curb parking spaces. So there are 20 people for every curb parking space. And when you have public meetings about charging for parking, they've had drivers, they yell loudest, and it gives the impression that everybody wants free parking at the curb. A better way to do it is to do a survey and ask people, what's your highest uh, uh, priority for using the curb? London did this. They asked people exactly that question. What's your highest priority? What should the revenue be used for? And the curb parking was the fifth highest priority. The highest priority was to plant trees in the curb lane and parks, or to use them for restaurants, or to use them for playgrounds for children. So think of this in Manhattan. If you have 20 people for every curb parking space and you ask them what do they want, I estimated that this is the most, and New York City has the highest short-term parking rates on earth. If you want to park for an hour, it's often $20, and it can be $20 off street. Because the on-street parking is filled with cars stored long term. So I think that if you charge for curb parking and spent the revenue to pay for public services for the 200,000 people who live there, they would say, yes, I think that's a better use than hard to find free parking for cars. And if everybody had that option, that if you asked for a vote or just took a survey, I think many people would, in the densest parts of the world, like New York City, they say, well, yes, this is some of the most valuable land on earth, and I don't think it should be given away free for cars. Well, I guess that's my answer to your question.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a few questions from Kara. So she's asking, what is San Jose's parking to office space requirement?
What is San Jose's?
Parking to office space requirement. So how many parking spaces for, let's say?
I think, well, I think it's 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet.
Okay.
I showed that I think in one of the slides, but it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't. I think 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet is the typical parking requirement for office buildings. And planners call that the golden ratio.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to understand. Back in 1943, the Los Angeles County Planning Commission said that the parking lot has to be at least as big as the building. And 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet is about 30% bigger than the size of the building.
Great, thank you. And so another question is, what is the source of the Oakland example bar chart that you provided? If you can provide that source, I think people were interested to look at it in further detail.
Could you say that again, please?
The source of the Oakland example bar chart that you provided.
Which example?
Oakland example?
Oh, Oakland. Oh, yes. That was a study done at Berkeley. It's in the book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And it was the parking aspect of it was a very small part of it. They were looking at how developers chose what kind of building to build and how big and things like that. But if you, it's.
Do you remember the authors, Don?
Well, I could look right here. uh, well, I'll send it to you, Kara.
Thank you.
I'll email it.
And I hope we can post your fantastic slides online. I think people would love to see these slides, in addition to watching the hour recording that we will have up hopefully late next week, as well as all the other papers recorded and up at a YouTube site that goes through our archive menu at our main webpage. But yeah, we'd love to share these if that's all right.
Sure.
Thank you.
Wonderful, great. And I have one last question for you. So you mentioned that the cost of parking, if there is no free parking, the cost of parking will probably be, drivers are the ones who have to pay for parking. I was wondering how much of the parking cost will actually go to drivers, and maybe some of it may go to OEMs, because if parking is very expensive, their demand levels will go down. So will they have to pick up the bill, or at least some of it at some point, if parking is priced higher?
Well, it's hard to know. I think that one of the issues that was asked about, what about equity? This is very important. Cities can, of course, give discounts to low-income drivers. We give discounts on electricity and natural gas and water. We could also do it for parking. But if we give a discount, a subsidy for parking to low-income drivers, we ought to give the same subsidy to people who don't park a car on the street. That if you ride the bus, or if you walk or you bike, you want to get the same subsidy as a low-income driver. If you're equally low income, you should get an equal subsidy. So I think that offering a parking discount to low-income drivers is politically a very smart thing. But and we already do it for electricity and other lifeline rates, a lifeline parking rate, but we shouldn't restrict it to drivers.
Thank you very much. I think you answered all the questions we had in the chat box. Thanks again for joining us. And I'm sure a lot of us will benefit from the slides as well, in addition to the great talk.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. Farewell.
You can stay in here, Dawn. We've got 8 speakers coming up, and then we also have 3 other sessions. So I put those, I put a link to the program in the chat box. But if you want to hear us talk about automated electric vehicles, we've got 2 hours of that, and then we go into another topic. And looks like Mahmoud Fatmi is going to be our moderator for these first 4 papers. Matt, have you seen the moderator?
I have, and I'm going to do all the background stuff right now. So there might be a little pause right here.
Right, great. Thank you, Matt.